Hi, my name is Dan, and today we are going to take a closer look at my mock-up of the beginning of Mozart's 40th Symphony using duality strings. I will go into more detail later, but first, let's have a listen. Hello again, let's take a closer look. The first thing I did in order to create this project was to go to MuseScore and find a MIDI file of the symphony. I found one which was created by this friendly man under a public domain license, meaning anyone can use it for any purpose. It's a great resource for classical mockups, so go check it out. Now, if you work with the Synchron player, you already know that there are a lot of articulations and therefore a lot of key switches that each have to be pressed individually or programmed in, which can be a lot of work. For example, duality strings have up to 5 key switches per articulation. I'm a lazy guy, so usually I use an articulation set in Logic, but sadly Logic only supports up to 3 key switches per articulation, which is not enough for duality strings. That's why I use a very helpful little program by a company called Audio Grocery, which lets you build your own articulation set with up to 5 key switches per articulation. It's called XDAW, and I used it to build an articulation set with 102 articulations, which covers the basics I needed for this project. It doesn't include the different note release options, but for this project I decided to work without them. XDAW basically gives you a custom script for the Scripter plugin inside Logic Pro, which lets you trigger those extra key switches you need. What you get is a totally custom articulation set that works like any other articulation set inside Logic would. So you select a note or multiple notes, you select the articulation you want, and when it plays back you hear the articulation. Now let me show you how I used the articulation set to shape the performance of duality strings. If we look at the beginning of the symphony, for example, for these first notes I chose agile legato because they're fairly fast, and I chose a fast note attack because they should begin almost immediately. For the short notes I chose détaché marcato agile. My approach here was just to listen and then select the articulations that work best in my opinion. Notice how well they work together when I play them. Now, when I create my mockups, usually I tend to get distracted by small little details and then try to improve them until I think I can't improve them anymore. So for example, this little legato note here uses a malto vibrato legato instead of a poco vibrato legato, because then you get a slightly more pronounced legato bump, which I thought was appropriate for that particular note. But it also could just be me slowly going crazy, so yeah. What is very helpful though are the different controller data that you can put in for velocity crossfade, expression and timbre adjust. For example, here's the first phrase which is marked piano in the score. So I put the velocity crossfade at a low value with no change at all, while at the same time putting expression and timbre adjust at the highest value. This results in the whole phrase sounding, well, not really bad, but in my opinion rather mechanical and almost lifeless. Now I think you would agree that basically no one would leave this phrase just like that. Anyone would put in at least velocity crossfade data or even some expression. So that's what I did. I used velocity crossfade to create a little increase in energy basically that I heard in a lot of real recordings of the symphony. And then the phrase sounds like this. It's a subtle difference, but I think it's still definitely noticeable, and we can now use expression to shape that even further by creating a little ascending ramp in the first half of the phrase. And in the second half we can use expression to soften the note attacks to better highlight each third note and make it stand out more. Now everything is starting to sound really different, and we can strengthen this effect even further with timbre adjust. This basically lets you darken the sound of the whole instrument, and we can use that in the second half of the phrase. We already lowered those note attacks with expression, and now we can further soften them with timbre adjust. I'll admit, at these levels, the effect of timbre adjust is probably so subtle that you wouldn't notice a difference at all. I had more aggressive values at first, but then I dialed them back. But if you listen to everything in context, you get a sense of what changed. There's a certain bounciness that would be hard to achieve without these controls. Equally as important for shaping a performance as velocity crossfade or expression control are the note velocities of the different short notes. This symphonic movement contains a lot of accompanying eighth notes for violas, cellos and basses, for example in this passage. Second violins, violas, cellos and basses are playing different spiccato variants here. If you listen to them without the melody of the first violins, you will hear that they are not playing at the same velocities. My goal here was to avoid having everything sound too static and have sort of a fluctuation of energy that matches the melody of the first violins. Interestingly, you don't really notice the effect if we add the violins back in again. It is very subtle, and I think it works on a rather subconscious level. Again, these might seem like really small little details that don't make much of a difference, but I think in combination they can really help to make a performance sound convincing. Also very important in my opinion is the coherence or consistency of a sample library. It often is a lot of work to make a performance by a sample library sound consistent. For example, there might be instances where the different types of short notes don't really combine very well with each other, or the fast attacks of the long notes don't match those of the shorter notes. And what I found when working with duality strings is that this library manages to sound very coherent, especially when combining shorter notes with long notes or the different types of détaché notes. What really helps in this regard is the sheer amount of different articulations and variants that are available here, so you always can choose the one that suits your performance the best. To illustrate this, here are the first and second violins playing their parts while switching through a lot of different articulations, and I think they do so quite convincingly. I especially like the performance legato of the first violins at the very end. Now we come to a topic that I don't really want to talk about, but since I was asked to, I might as well do it. And that is my mix. Most of the time I have the feeling I don't have any idea what I'm doing. So I can show you what I did, but it won't be pretty, I think. For the woodwinds I used the awesome synchronized woodwinds with the close mix and raised the volume quite a bit to make them stand out more in my mix. I just love how smooth and agile this old library still sounds. Now onto the brass, which consists of the 2 horns from Synchron Brass using the classic room mix. And because I'm a lazy mixer, I used Gullfoss here, which is a plugin that pretty much automatically improves the sound and takes out some of the lower mids, which I wanted to get rid of. The volume of the horns is lowered quite substantially here because I didn't want them to overpower the strings or the woodwinds. Now we come to the strings, and here I also didn't do much, I just used the classic mix of the standard version. Then I used Soothe by OX Sound to decrease the low end of the basses. This works similar to Gullfoss. Then I added some equalization for the whole string group, before again using Soothe to get rid of some harshness in the upper mid-range. I lowered the volume for all strings in general, while boosting the violins for more detail. That's it for my bad mixing, here's my bad mastering. I drowned everything in 7th Heaven reverb because it sounds nice. Then I slapped a compressor on there with a 12% mix. Then I used the tape emulation because it sounds warm and I kind of liked how it pulled everything together. And then I used a little bit of EQ again because there was some high end I wanted to get rid of, I don't know if that was necessary. And finally I used the limiter as I always do. Well, this concludes my little video. I hope some of my ramblings made sense and I hope the mock-up sounded good to your ears. It has been fun working with duality strings and I think the library performed better than I was expecting. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like or a comment, and if you enjoyed the piece, listen to one of the many great recordings of this symphony. Bye!